When Scott Turner leveled his accusation, the room expected sparks to fly. He was known for his confident delivery, the kind that played well for cameras and drew headlines. His words carried a rhythm meant to sound certain, framing Jasmine Crockett as evasive and politically cautious. It was a well-rehearsed performance, the kind that aimed to put her on the defensive, but Crockett didn't react the way most would. Instead of meeting fire with fire, she leaned into precision. She didn't rush to counter every point or raise her voice to match his tone. She simply listened, letting Turner build his case and, in doing so, letting him build his own trap. Turner's statement sounded polished, but beneath the surface, it was built on a shaky understanding of the actual timeline. When he accused her of ducking responsibility for a housing reform decision, Crockett waited for the right moment, then calmly reached for her notes. She didn't start by saying he was wrong. She started by saying, "Let's walk through this carefully." Those words alone shifted the dynamic. It was no longer an argument. It became an audit of truth. What made Crockett's response powerful wasn't the passion behind it, it was the precision. She didn't just deny his accusation. She dismantled it with verifiable information. In less than a minute, she outlined the bill's progression, the dates she had addressed the issue publicly, and the committee hearings where she'd already given statements. Each fact was specific, and each reference could be checked. It wasn't grandstanding, it was evidence. Turner, who had entered the exchange with the upper hand of performance, found himself up against something far stronger. Accuracy. The difference between the two was clear. Turner relied on tone, while Crockett relied on truth. He leaned on the emotional weight of accusation. She leaned on the quiet confidence of documentation. There was no flourish in her voice, no need to dramatize. She spoke like someone who had done her homework, who knew that the facts, when properly aligned, didn't need embellishment. The contrast exposed how fragile Turner's argument actually was. Observers later noted that Crockett didn't just defend herself, she reframed the conversation entirely. Instead of reacting to the accusation, she redirected it into a lesson on accountability and transparency. She pointed out that her votes, committee comments, and floor statements were all publicly available, something Turner could have verified before making his claim. That single point made calmly diffused the entire premise of his attack. It wasn't that she overpowered him, it was that she outpreppered him. The beauty of her approach was how surgical it felt. Every sentence she spoke had purpose. There were no wasted words, no detours into emotion or sarcasm. When Turner tried to interject, she didn't talk over him. She simply continued, citing another date or document, leaving little room for dispute. It was the kind of clarity that comes from knowing you don't need to prove your honesty, only to show the facts that confirm it. Turner, for his part, began to shift uncomfortably as her explanation unfolded. What started as confidence began to look like retreat. He had entered the discussion expecting a back-and-forth debate, but Crockett gave him none of that energy. Her focus stayed on the record, not the rhetoric. And in that subtle difference, she won the moment completely. When someone like Turner builds an argument on assumption, it can sound strong until someone with precision shows up. That's what Crockett did. She brought clarity to a space crowded with conjecture. Her 42-second response reminded everyone in the room, and everyone watching, that sometimes the sharpest rebuttal isn't loud or dramatic, it's simply accurate. Precision strips away the layers of performance and exposes what's left underneath. Turner's accusation dissolved not because she attacked him personally, but because she respected the audience enough to let facts do the talking. That approach turned what could have been a political scuffle into a moment of quiet accountability. Her confidence didn't come from charisma, it came from preparation. She didn't win with emotion, she won with evidence. And in politics where so much is said to sound right, Jasmine Crockett showed that what truly matters is what's provably true. Scott Turner came into the hearing room with his usual confidence. He was articulate, assertive, and used to commanding attention. His tone carried the sharp edge of someone who expected a reaction, and more often than not, he got one. But that day, when he directed his accusation at Jasmine Crockett, the reaction he got wasn't outrage or defensiveness, it was silence. Crockett didn't flinch, didn't interrupt, and didn't even shift in her chair. She simply watched him speak, listening to every word, every inflection, and every pause. Her calmness wasn't passive. It was intentional. That composure immediately changed the room. Turner's energy seemed almost too forceful against her quiet steadiness. He was clearly trying to provoke. That's how many political confrontations unfold. When one side raises its tone, the other usually follows, and soon it turns into noise. But Crockett didn't take that bait. She let him talk himself into a corner, not by manipulation, but by discipline. By the time Turner finished, his words had stretched longer than intended, and the weight of silence that followed made them sound weaker than they had moments before. Then she spoke. Her voice was even, deliberate, and measured. She didn't rush to fill the air. She let the pause breathe just long enough to remind everyone who had control of the room. "Mr. Turner," she said softly, "if we're going to have this conversation, let's start with facts, not frustration." The choice of words was simple, but the delivery was surgical. It was the kind of calm that only someone truly grounded in their position could maintain. She didn't need to match his energy. She absorbed it and redirected it with precision. Composure. In that moment, became her greatest weapon. Turner's accusation lost its impact because it collided with steadiness instead of resistance. Crockett's restraint wasn't weakness. It was strategy. When he tried to push the conversation toward emotion, she stayed anchored in logic. When he raised his voice slightly, hers remained even. Every move he made to provoke her highlighted just how unshaken she was. The visual contrast alone told the story. One person trying to control the narrative, and the other quietly dismantling it without breaking composure. It's a rare thing in politics to see someone win an exchange without raising their voice. Turner's confidence relied on rhythm, the natural sway of persuasion, but Crockett's confidence came from patience. She knew when to wait, when to speak, and when to let silence carry meaning. At one point, as he tried to clarify his point, she looked up, met his eyes, and simply said, "I'm still waiting for the part where I avoided anything." That one sentence, delivered in the same calm tone, stripped away the emotional layer of his argument. The audience laughed quietly, not because it was funny, but because the composure behind it made his point collapse. Observers later noted that her stillness had power. She didn't react, she responded. Turner may have expected a defensive rebuttal or a loud denial, but instead he faced something far more difficult to counter, a person in complete control of her emotions. When someone like Crockett stays calm under accusation, it communicates something deeper. Confidence in truth. It's hard to rattle someone who knows exactly where they stand, and the more composed she remained, the more unsteady Turner appeared. That balance between restraint and clarity defined the entire exchange. Turner relied on momentum. He built arguments that gathered speed through repetition and tone. Crockett relied on poise. She let his momentum fade before responding with something precise and grounded. By not meeting his energy, she effectively neutralized it. The more he tried to dominate the space, the smaller his points seemed to become. She never once appeared flustered, even when he tried to interrupt. Instead, she raised a hand slightly and said, "You'll get your turn, Congressman. I didn't interrupt you." It wasn't confrontational, it was composed authority. That kind of composure takes discipline. It's built from experience, from knowing that arguments don't need to be loud to be strong. Turner's frustration became visible toward the end. His tone softened, his words less certain. Crockett, meanwhile, remained consistent, her demeanor unchanged from start to finish. She didn't gloat or smirk. She didn't need to. The silence between her sentences did the work. By staying composed, Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself, she reshaped the energy of the entire hearing. She turned an accusation into an example of self-control. Her calm dismantled Turner's confidence not through confrontation, but through consistency. In that 42-second exchange, it became clear that real strength isn't always in how loud you speak, but in how steady you remain when others try to shake you. When Scott Turner made his accusation, his strategy was clear. He wanted to create doubt through assertion. He came prepared with confident phrasing, trying to sound authoritative even without solid evidence. His claim that Jasmine Crockett had avoided addressing a major policy issue was built more on suggestion than on fact. It was the kind of statement meant to stick in the air, to linger long enough that people might start believing it. But Crockett's answer didn't just clear her name. It exposed how fragile that kind of accusation becomes when faced with real facts. Crockett didn't argue emotionally or try to counter his tone. Instead, she turned to something far more effective: documentation. The moment she began speaking, the tone of the room shifted from speculation to verification. She didn't rely on rhetoric, she relied on record. "Let's deal with what's actually been said and done," she began, her voice steady and unhurried. Turner, who had expected pushback, seemed momentarily thrown off by how quickly she grounded the discussion in evidence. She went step by step, explaining the policy in question, referencing dates, statements, and committee transcripts that supported her record. Each detail she mentioned could be found in the public record, a reminder that nothing she was saying was opinion. The precision of her points left no room for Turner to twist her meaning or reframe her words. What he had presented as avoidance turned into an example of transparency. It wasn't that she outtalked him, she outfacted him. Turner tried to regain footing, interjecting to clarify that the public perception was that she hadn't addressed the issue directly. Crockett didn't raise her voice or rush to correct him. She just looked up and said, "That perception only exists when people ignore the record. Let's not mistake that for reality." The calm, fact-based delivery carried more weight than any sharp rebuttal could have. In a room often fueled by emotion, her use of pure information stood out. The reason facts are so powerful in these moments is because they strip away narrative. Turner's accusation depended on interpretation, on the audience accepting his framing as truth. But facts don't leave space for framing. They are either right or wrong. And as Crockett laid them out, one after another, the argument Turner had built began to crumble. He couldn't challenge her citations without contradicting publicly available information. Every attempt he made to pivot or redirect only emphasized how solid her foundation was. Crockett's approach showed something rare in modern political exchange: discipline in truth. She didn't over-explain or rely on clever wording. She let the record speak for her, which gave her response authenticity. Facts have a way of cutting through exaggeration, and that's exactly what happened. Turner's tone, which had started strong, softened as he realized that every part of his argument had been addressed and diffused. At one point, she paused after listing a specific set of committee hearings. "Those records are accessible to everyone here," she said, glancing briefly around the room before returning her gaze to Turner. "So if this is about facts, we've got them. If it's about perception, that's something else entirely." Her restraint in not accusing him personally made her words even sharper. She wasn't attacking his character. She was exposing the weakness in his reasoning. Turner nodded slightly, his expression tightening. He had come to make a point but was now watching it dissolve in real time. What Crockett did so effectively was remind everyone that truth isn't subjective when evidence is available. By grounding the exchange in verifiable detail, she closed every exit Turner could use to redirect the conversation. That's the quiet power of facts. They don't just defend, they corner falsehood. Observers in the room described her 42-second rebuttal as surgical. It wasn't flashy, and it didn't need to be. She didn't perform for the cameras or seek applause. She simply used clarity to dismantle complexity. The simplicity of truth became her shield and her sword. Turner's accusation, once full of confidence, now looked unsteady, unsupported by anything tangible. In politics, where arguments often thrive on ambiguity, Crockett's insistence on evidence created a moment of undeniable clarity. Facts left no room for interpretation, no space for speculation, and no path for Turner to recover his footing. Each statement she made carried the weight of proof, not persuasion. And as she concluded her response, the silence that followed said more than any applause could. It was the silence that comes when truth ends a debate before it even begins. Turner entered the committee room with the confidence of someone who knew how to command attention. He had the tone, the timing, and the practiced delivery of a seasoned speaker. When he directed his accusation at Jasmine Crockett, his goal wasn't just to challenge her record, it was to publicly put her on the defensive. He framed his words carefully, using phrases that sounded official but left space for interpretation. It was the kind of performance that worked well in politics, where perception often matters as much as truth. But Crockett didn't engage with his performance. She responded with professionalism, and that changed everything. As Turner laid out his points, Crockett didn't show even a hint of frustration. Her posture stayed the same, her attention fixed on him. There were no exaggerated expressions, no visible irritation. She waited, patient and composed, allowing him to finish completely before she spoke. That small act of discipline signaled something powerful: control. By letting him have the floor, she showed that she wasn't intimidated, and she wasn't rushing to defend herself. She was confident enough to let him say everything he needed to say, because she knew that when it was her turn, the truth would stand on its own. When she finally responded, her voice was calm, even, and deliberate. There was no trace of sarcasm or hostility. She addressed Turner directly but respectfully, beginning with a clarification rather than a counterattack. "Congressman Turner," she said, "I appreciate that you care about accountability. So do I, but let's make sure we're both talking about what actually happened." That opening line disarmed him almost instantly. It didn't dismiss his concern. The tension in the room started to shift. Instead of two people clashing, it became one person leading the discussion back toward professionalism. Turner had expected resistance. What he got instead was composure. And composure in that setting carried more authority than confrontation ever could. Crockett outlined her points carefully, referencing documentation, and explaining her position with precision. But it wasn't just her words that made an impact. It was her demeanor. She didn't rush. She didn't try to win the room by volume or theatrics. She focused on clarity, and every sentence landed with quiet confidence. Her professionalism wasn't an act. It was an extension of how she worked. That contrast between her poise and Turner's performance was striking. Turner had entered the room ready for a political moment. Crockett gave him a policy discussion. The difference exposed the imbalance in their approaches. While he was trying to create pressure, she was showing patience. While he wanted reaction, she offered reason. The more grounded she became, the less stable his tone sounded. It wasn't that Turner was unprepared. It was that his approach relied on emotion, and emotion loses power when faced with professionalism. At one point, as Turner tried to interject, Crockett gently raised her hand and said, "I'll yield when I'm done. Congressman, you had your time." I listened. Her tone was firm but courteous. She didn't chastise him, and she didn't sound irritated. She simply reminded him, and everyone watching, that respect worked both ways. It was a small moment, but it underscored her control. Professionalism isn't about being polite for the sake of image. It's about setting boundaries without aggression. That's exactly what she did. Asterisk by the time she finished her short, fact-based rebuttal, Turner's demeanor had softened noticeably. His earlier assertiveness gave way to quiet nods and brief glances at his notes. The confrontation he expected never arrived. Instead, he was met with someone who elevated the discussion by refusing to be drawn into conflict. Crockett's tone stayed steady, her message clear, and her presence unwavering. The room seemed to take on that same calm energy. Even the murmurs faded. Her professionalism had not only diffused the tension, it had redirected the atmosphere toward civility. Asterisk observers noted afterward that her response was a reminder of what leadership looks like under pressure. She didn't need to embarrass Turner to prove her point. She simply stayed aligned with her values, respect, accuracy, and composure. Those qualities did the work for her. Turner, realizing his accusation hadn't just failed, but had been met with integrity, could do little but acknowledge her poise. Asterisk what made Crockett's handling of the moment so powerful was that she didn't aim to win the argument, she aimed to uphold the standard. Her behavior reflected what professionalism truly means. Maintaining grace when challenged, maintaining focus when provoked, and maintaining respect when it's not returned. Scott Turner may have entered that hearing expecting to dominate the exchange, but Jasmine Crockett left it showing that real authority doesn't come from raising your voice. It comes from knowing when to keep it steady. When the exchange finally ended, the atmosphere in the room felt noticeably different. What began as a tense, charged confrontation had settled into something quieter, not because the tension vanished, but because Jasmine Crockett's response had reset the tone entirely. In just 42 seconds, she managed to do what long speeches and rehearsed defenses often fail to accomplish. She brought clarity.com and truth into a space clouded by accusation. Asterisk Scott Turner had entered the moment believing that confidence alone could carry his point. He had experience, stage presence, and the ability to deliver a message with conviction. But conviction without evidence quickly loses its footing. What Crockett demonstrated wasn't just a rebuttal to his claim. It was a lesson in leadership that professionalism and preparation outlast performance every time. Asterisk her precision showed that when facts are properly presented, they speak for themselves. Her composure revealed that strength isn't measured in volume, but in restraint. And her professionalism reminded everyone watching that respect under pressure is a quiet form of power, one that can't be faked or forced. Turner's accusation might have been designed to create doubt, but in the end, it only highlighted Crockett's discipline. Asterisk as cameras continued rolling and onlookers processed what had happened, there was a sense that the real story wasn't just about an accusation being disproven. It was about how it was disproven. Crockett didn't need theatrics or applause. She needed only the truth, presented clearly and calmly. That's what left an impression. She had taken a moment of confrontation and turned it into a model of accountability not just for herself, but for how discourse should be conducted. Asterisk for Turner. The experience seemed humbling. There was no shouting match, no dramatic retreat, just a visible realization that composure and fact-based reasoning can't easily be outperformed. He had come to challenge her credibility, but walked away facing the quiet authority of someone who didn't just defend herself. She elevated the entire discussion. Asterisk in that short span of time, Crockett managed to remind everyone watching, colleagues, viewers, and critics alike, that politics doesn't have to be about who can speak the loudest or who can win the soundbite. It can still be about substance, patience, and truth. Her ability to handle confrontation without losing grace became its own form of victory. Asterisk. By the time she closed her folder and moved on to the next agenda item, the exchange had already become something larger than a single hearing moment. It stood as proof that professionalism can still thrive amid the noise, that facts still have weight, and that integrity still matters. Scott Turner may have begun that hearing expecting to make a statement, but it was Jasmine Crockett who ended it with a response so composed, so precise, and so grounded in truth that it required no defense